This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Welcome to Aquariumania. I'm your host, DrRoy, speaking to you from the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory. Thanks for joining us. Which fishes commonly court their potential mates on land, can climb up mangrove trees, and dig deep burrows to lay eggs? The incredible mudskipper. Although mudskippers have made it big in some children's cartoons, very few people really understand how unique and varied this group of fishes is. My guest today, Dr. Gianluca Polgar, is the world's foremost expert on mudskippers and an aquarium hobbyist at heart. Join us as Dr. Polgar shares his vast knowledge of the mighty mudskipper. We'll be right back after these messages.
Put on a perfectly pawsome pet party. Having an awesome birthday or adoption day celebration for your four-legged friend? Or just want a fun excuse to throw a fun party with your friends from the dog park? Deck out your party with Molly and Bandit Pet Party accessories. Party products designed specifically for pets. There are wearables, including adjustable pet party hats, bow ties, and tutus. The photo prop kits include funny glasses and hats. The party supplies and decorations include coordinating table covers, party banners, cake decorations, and treat bowls, cups, and bags. Everything you need to create great memories and Instagram-worthy photos. They're available in two colorful themes, tropical and fireman. It's a dog's life. Celebrate it with Molly and Bandit Pet Party at mollyandbanditpetparty.com/petlife.
Let's Talk Pets on PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Aquariumania on Pet Life Radio. My guest today is Dr. Gianluca Polgar, research scientist at University Brunei Darussalam and mudskipper expert. Thanks so much for staying up late for this interview, Gianluca.
Hi, welcome.
So I have a lot of preliminary questions, just some background questions to get an idea of how you became interested in the hobby and mudskippers. How old were you when you first started keeping fish? And what was your very first aquarium setup and your very first fish species?
Well, I was, I think, only 5 years old when I had the first fish. I think it was a channel catfish, Icterus punctatus. It is an invasive species in Italy, I guess. I think I won it maybe in a Luna Park and kept it in a fish bowl. But then I went to aquarium shops and I was absolutely fascinated by tropical freshwater fishes. My first tank was 120 liters tank, and I was, I think, 6 years old. And it contained a lot of different species, mostly live burrows, like bacillids and Corydorus catfishes and all that sort of very typical tropical aquarium fishes. I've been keeping aquariums, paludariums, and terrariums during all my school and university years, up to 13 tanks. And I was mostly interested by unusual fishes such as big ears, luric catfishes, and amphibians as well, frogs and newts.
So how did you first become interested in mudskippers?
Yeah, I think I saw a photo of a mudskipper in a book when I was at school. During the years, I, however, never found them in aquarium shops, and they were almost virtually unknown in the Italian fish trade at that time. And as an undergraduate, I was looking for an idea for my MSc project, and I started to look for them in the literature. And of course, you mean a fish out of water, something very weird and interesting. I found that almost nothing was known about them at that time, and my scientific interest, let's say, grew exponentially. They ended up to be the subject of my MSc thesis, and then I also found them in the pet trade. Therefore, I started to rear them, and I totally fell in love with them, I would say.
So you currently work at the University Brunei Darussalam. Where exactly is that located? I know there's probably folks listening that have no idea where you are.
So Brunei is a rather, of course, small and distant country, both from Italy and USA. It is a small sultanate, so sort of a kingdom, located in northern Borneo. And in fact, Brunei is the original name of Borneo, this huge island that is the third largest island in the world. And it's located right in the middle of the maritime Southeast Asia. say, east of Malaysia, more or less.
So let's talk a little bit about Mudskipper basics now. You've done so much work, and I was really impressed with your website. We'll talk about that a little more. But how many species of mudskippers are there?
The answer depends on the definition of mudskipper. That's the subfamily Oxudercine, although recent findings suggest that it is no more valid, includes about 40 species and belonging to 10 genera. However, usually only those ones that regularly and volitionally come out of water are considered mudskippers. And with this latter definition, that would include 5 genera and 32 species. For sure, the most iconic mudskippers are probably those of the genus Periophthalmus, or I would say, Perios, that include 18 species, and Boleophthalmus, including 6 species. I described one earlier this year.
So maybe can you give us a brief description of what they look like for folks? A lot of people have maybe heard of them or seen them. They are pretty popular in some cartoons here. Can you describe maybe briefly what a mudskipper looks like?
Well, they are gobies. All the genera of mudskippers in their scientific names are terms which refer to their eyes. So, the pretty most obvious thing in a mudskipper is their eyes. They are very dorsally positioned eyes, very big eyes, frog-like, I would say, and usually relatively large heads and limb-like pectoral fins. Well, they come out of water. This is the most obvious thing. Yeah.
Where in the world can mudskippers be found?
They have a rather large distribution. In fact, the whole distribution of the subfamily is very well represented by the distribution of the genus Periophthalmus. It is distributed from the east coast of Africa eastward to Pacific Ocean and the French Indies. So it's a huge distribution in terms of longitude range, and in terms of latitudinal range. They go from the Red Sea, northern Gulf in India, and southern Japan, and south to southern Africa and southeast Australia. So it's a rather large distribution.
Okay, so primarily Australia, Asia, and Africa?
Yeah, more or less, yes. And yes, of course, there is one single species found on the west coast of Africa, so Atlantic Africa.
Where do most of the mudskippers in the aquarium hobby come from?
Well, I guess it depends on the markets. In Italy and USA, as I can say from the feedback I received from there, most species in the aquarium trade come from West Africa, the Atlantic mudskipper, as I just said, Periophthalmus barbarus. From Vietnam, Periophthalmodon septum radiatus. From India, Periophthalmus novarum radiatus, or Indian mudskipper. From Thailand and Singapore, Periophthalmus variabilis, Periophthalmus gracilis. And some other species might occasionally be found in the market, such as the giant mudskipper, Periophthalmus schlosseri, the herbivore Boleophthalmus bodarti, sometimes called the dragon goby, and closely related species such as Oxuderchus dentatus, or crocodile goby, and Periophthalmus Pseudoapocryptus elongatus, the elongate goby, but usually these latter ones are more uncommon. And mudskippers are still not very popular, and they often are misidentified and sold with different and inconsistent names in the pet trade.
So what kind of environmental conditions do they live in general?
Well, most of mudskipper species live in soft-bottomed intertidal habitats. It means along coast and coastal habitats. Typically, they live on tropical intertidal ecosystems, such as tidal flats and mangrove forests. However, they can also occur in a variety of different habitats, for example, along the lower tracts of rivers, riverbanks, and even inside freshwater swamps, and sometimes on sand flats, even on rocks in some Pacific islands. However, all mudskipper species always need soft sediments to dig their burrows. And in terms of climatic conditions, they are distributed in tropical, subtropical, even in some places in temperate regions, such as southern Japan. Some species, for example, overwinter. Well, in general, the chemical and physical conditions in such habitats are extremely variable during the day, so it's a bit difficult to say anything more specific than this.
So I guess in terms of maybe temperature ranges and salinity range, they can go from fairly cool to warm, and then what about salinity?
Salinity, well, it is extremely variable and it varies in different species. For example, some species can be found in very terrestrial conditions and then, of course, nearly fresh water, such as Periphthalmus weberi in Papua New Guinea and Australia. But these particular fish is, for example, found also in brackish conditions. So it is very haline. I mean, it can live in many different salinity conditions. Some few species, such as Zappa confluentus, have only been found in freshwater. Others almost exclusively in freshwater, such as Periphthalmodon septenradiatus, and others in almost full seawater, such as Vodophthalmus pectinirostris. Some species, for example, such as Periphthalmus minutus, can live on salt flats in burrows that are so infrequently covered by high tides that can contain water at more than 70 ppt salinity. In general, however, species living in middle, high, or intertidal habitats, such as Periphthalmus variabilis, Periphthalmus gracilis, live in extremely variable conditions due to the occurrence of, rain spells, the action of tides, and of course the daily, weekly, or seasonal variations of these factors: spring tide, neap tide, monsoons, and so on and so forth.
So in general, a lot of them have a fairly wide tolerance of salinities.
Well, yes. In general, yes. As I said, in typically high to mid intertidal zones, salinity in tide pools during low tide can be as low as 0 and as high as 40 to 50 ppt. So, yes, in general, they are adaptable to different salinity conditions. They found that the least stressful conditions for them is about around 15 ppt, something like that.
Let's talk a little bit about their biology and physiology, because they're really, again, very unique. I guess the first question is, how long, on average, I know there's a lot of different species, but on average, would you say mudskippers can stay out of water? And how are they able to do it?
Oh, okay. One thing is, what is their tolerance? And here a lot of different factors can determine the tolerance. And one thing is, how much time do they spend out of water in natural conditions? I mean, experimental conditions can be fairly different than natural conditions, right? In general, you would see that a typical mudskipper would frequently shuttle back and forth rather different conditions in terms of microhabitat. I mean, very small changes but frequent changes in both in terms of time and space. So there are reports of mudskippers which remained alive for more than a couple of days on a moist substrate and in humid still air, but not many studies, in fact, had been conducted on this, maybe perhaps surprisingly, on this aspect of their physiology. I, for example, recently conducted some studies on their high temperature tolerance, and also water loss. I would say that the main secret of adaptation to air exposure and terrestrial activities in most mudskippers probably lies in the periodic use of water-filled burrows and small puddles of water that they can find in their habitats. Since they are relatively small, even very small amounts of water, and they allow them to moisten the skin and excrete metabolic wastes during low tide. And they are also very mobile. And as I said, in their habitats, conditions can vary drastically with time and space in very short amounts of time and in very short amounts of space. So you can have a puddle here and totally dry conditions there, and within a matter of hours, everything becomes flooded or it's baked into the sun. So we still need to better understand how do they regulate and manage their time in this mosaic of very different conditions they can experience during low tide.
Okay, but I guess just a real basic question. So if they're in a tank and they're out of water for 5, 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, that's not a very long time, right?
No, it's not a big deal, for them. No, okay. Definitely not. Well, of course, if you are blowing them with a fan, and then and they, are baking and under infrared lamp, that would change a lot.
Sure. Okay. You talked a little bit about their fins. Can you explain how they're able to move around on land?
Mudskippers exhibit a rather remarkable variety of movements, of locomotory behaviors, so of movements while out of water. The most typically observed ones are the jump behavior, of course. They just bend their bodies and then extend them rapidly like springs, and the speed and acceleration they can reach is comparable to frogs. And there is the so-called crouching behavior. since they seem to walk like on crutches. Basically, they drag their body forward with their pectoral fin while sustaining the body weight with their pelvic fins. And in some cases, some species also arch their body in a vertical plane, which is pretty unusual for a fish. And then there is the perching behavior. They can attach to vertical surfaces pretty well. The climbing behavior, which is a combination of perching and crouching, so they can move vertically. And then there are some variants. For example, the skating behavior, they can just slide on very wet substrates. Some behaviors are performed on the surface of water, like the surfing behavior. They can skip across the surface of water like flat stones, a behavior which is similar to some flying fishes, exoceted flying fishes. So there are a lot of different ways they can move around.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm sure that's why some of the cartoons have made a lot of use of mudskippers. One question before we take a quick break. I understand they can tolerate very high ammonia, and a lot of it's because they're living in areas that have a lot of really bad or harsher conditions. How high levels and how is it possible they can live with such bad ammonia?
Well, this is a pretty complex question. Ammonia, in general, are rather toxic for the brains of vertebrates when they build up in the blood. Although, apparently different mechanisms take place in mudskippers' brains, as they found. Mudskippers can tolerate concentrations to up to 450 micromolar concentrations of ammonia, which is something like more than 4 milligrams per liter, which is rather high tolerance, and they can tolerate that for hours or days. Of course, there is a lot of variation between different species, as always. For example, and only a few species have been studied in this respect. For example, genera of Periphthalmus and Bolophthalmus. Ammonia tolerance is probably related to the capacity of living in small amounts of highly polluted water during low tide, such as, for example, inside burrows or in tide pools, which probably share with other aquatic gobies living in similar habitats during low tide. As in other fishes, their main excretory organ is the gills. So, as in other fishes, kidneys are not involved in excretion. And gills, of course, are only partially functional while out of water. Therefore, the high tolerance to ammonia loading while underwater in mudskippers reasonably is a pre-adaptation to tolerate the build-up of ammonia occurring while out of water, due to the fact that, as I said, the gills cannot really efficiently excrete ammonia while out of water. Several different strategies of ammonia tolerance and excretion can be found in different mudskipper species and even in the same species. One strategy is to slow down the build-up while they are out of water. One strategy is to chemically transform toxic compounds into non-toxic compounds, such as some amino acids, and also obtain energy while out of water. Others include making the skin less permeable to ammonia and even excreting acids in small amount of water. And they can modify the pH of small amount of waters, for example, when inside the burrows, to facilitate ammonium ion excretion and inhibit ammonia intake in high ammonia loading conditions. For example, Periphthalmus schlosseri is able to excrete ammonia even at pH 9, which is rather high, so alkaline conditions. Other mudskippers can concentrate ammonia in the tissues to reduce the rate of ammonia intake. For example, Bolophthalmus bodarti, the dragon goby. They also found that after eating, there is a partial synthesis of urea, which is less toxic than ammonia, but they still mainly excrete non-urea ammonia compounds. Most interesting, in 2007, they found that Periphthalmus schlosseri is able to excrete water solutions from the gills while out of water with extremely high concentration of ammonia, more than 90 millimolar, which is something like 990 milligrams per liter. In a way, they can somehow pee from the gills while out of water, which is pretty amazing.
That's great. I have a lot more questions. I want to talk to you a little bit about mudskipper reproduction, maybe a little bit more about their eyes, and then about keeping mudskippers for folks that may want to consider keeping them. But let's take a short break, and we'll continue our discussion with mudskipper expert Dr. Gianluca Polgar after these messages from our sponsors.
It's designerpetsweaters.com. Hand-knitted designer sweaters for your precious pup or cool cat. beautiful couture patterns for your pets, including custom-knitted formal wear, casual wear, yachting, and even sports-themed. Many designer pet sweaters include feathered tammy hats, top hats, and a lot of sparkle. Each sweater includes leg loops, front paw sleeves, and leash opening. Visit designerpetsweaters.com to order your four-legged fashions today. Your pets will stay warm for the winter and be runway ready. Large or small, we fit them all. designerpetsweaters.com.
Let's talk pets
Let's talk pets
on Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
We're back and continuing our conversation with my guest, Dr. Gianluca Polgar from University Brunei Darussalam. So you gave us a lot of really good information. Before we talk a little bit about reproduction and about what folks need to know to keep mudskippers, let's talk about their eyes a little more. They have really, as you mentioned, kind of frog-like eyes. They can do a lot of things with their eyes. Can you tell us a little bit more about their eyes?
The first and most remarkable fact maybe is that even if it is a bit debatable, is that they apparently do not see very well underwater. They seem to be seeing much better while out of water. Their eyes have modified corneas and lenses relative to other gobies and are rather well adapted for vision in air. They're even specialized for vision in air both at short and long distances. Indeed, it is very difficult to make scientific observations, for example, of their amphibious behavior, since it is extremely difficult to observe them without being observed when out of water. Even the slightest movement would be captured by them. They have modified eye muscles, which allow to completely retract their eyes into special pockets of skin beneath them. These pockets are called dermal cups and probably have a similar function to our eyelids. So they are unique structures among fishes, so they could be called as pseudo-eyelids. These, of course, allow them to moisten the eye's surface while out of water. Interestingly, it seems that the extreme dorsal position of their eyes, as in fact other features of their body, which are already dorsally positioned in other gobies, is a secondary effect of the accelerated development that they experience during the very rapid metamorphosis from larvae to juveniles, living on the substrate and then coming out of water. So since they have to metamorphose so rapidly before the change of the tide brings them out of the intertidal zone, this acceleration of the dorsal migration of the eyes might have produced this pretty unique effect of extremely dorsally positioned eyes.
They can also move them independently to a degree, right?
Yes, well, they can retract them independently. I'm not really sure of this independent orientation of them. I never made specific observations about that, even if it's a bit of common sense, I think.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the reproduction, which I found really fascinating. I had, I think I mentioned to you a while back, I had mudskippers in a 100-gallon tank, and one day they just started digging into the sand really aggressively. And I read up a little bit and learned they had some really interesting methods for breeding. Can you tell us, briefly a little bit about how they court each other and also how they, actually breed and dig their burrows, all that sort of thing?
Okay, breeding behavior is almost unknown in most mudskipper species. In the few species where some scientific observations have been made, the life cycle is pretty similar. As all gobies, they dig burrows. Most gobies dig burrows. They not only dig burrows to breed, they also dig burrows as a part of their territorial behavior. So they usually have rather restricted home ranges around a point of reference, a spatial point of reference, and this point of reference is usually the burrow. But this is not true in all species. For example, in some species, such as Periphthalmus crassus pilis, burrows are observed only during the reproductive activity, the breeding. This being said, breeding was observed in a tank only in a handful of cases, 3 or 4 documented cases, and not the whole life cycle, only a part of the breeding behavior. The only whole life cycle I'm aware of was observed in Periphthalmus modestus in the 70s, and they were artificially fertilized eggs. So the life cycle of a mudskipper is very similar to that one of many related groups of gobies. They lay their eggs inside the burrow, and then the larvae hatch, and they have a pelagic larval phase, so they live offshore, possibly, probably, no one knows for sure, but they live in water, so in the water column. And then there is a recruitment phase when they come back to the intertidal zone, a settlement phase where they become, during metamorphosis, benthonic, so they relate to the substrate, and then they come out of water and they become juvenile metamorphosed mudskippers.
Can you maybe mention a little bit of how they court each other and also what the burrows look like? Because that's, I think, really interesting, how they lay their eggs and all that, and how they maintain the eggs in the burrows.
Yeah, the eggs are laid in all the observed species are laid on the ceiling of a dome-shaped chamber which is filled with air. So the level of oxygen inside the burrows is almost zero especially during high tide, but also during low tide. So the eggs could not develop inside the burrow if mudskippers don't bring air inside this chamber, and they maintain it regularly by shuttling back and forth during low tide and bringing a bubble of air, keeping them in their mouth and throat. This behavior was described in 1998 for the first time, and is absolutely typical of mudskippers, I would say unique. And it is part of their air gulping behavior. So mudskippers gulp bubble of air and use the opercular pouches, the mouth and the throat as a sort of air breathing organ while out of water. And this is, of course, a pre-adaptation to this parental care behavior to allow for development inside these anoxic burrows.
Can you tell us also a little bit about the courtship behavior and I guess some of the territorial behaviors? Because I think that's fairly interesting too.
Okay, as adults, all mudskippers are territorial, as far as we know. There are some exceptions, in fact. For example, Periophthalmus crassus pilus is territorial only during the reproductive period, apparently. Daily migrates with a tidal cycle from the pioneer shore, from the vegetated pioneer shore, the trees of mangroves, to the mud flats, to the open mud flats when the tide is ebbing, and then back to the trees when it is flooding. So they are just aggregating on the roots and trees when the tide is high, and then they scattered across the mud flats to feed when the tide is low, and apparently do not exhibit territorial behaviors. But when the male digs the reproductive burrow, then territorial behaviors are observed. Apart from this case, in general, all the observed behaviors of mudskippers suggest the presence of strong territoriality, which usually is organized, as I said, around the burrow as a point of reference, and therefore rather limited home ranges. Tidal migrations of individuals were also observed in other species, for example, Periophthalmus argentlinearus. So we are still not really sure about how many species are really territorial during the whole adult life or only during reproduction.
Can you describe maybe the actual behaviors? What do they do? How do they act?
In terms of courtship, in terms of territorial behaviors?
Yes.
Okay, in terms of courtship, well, the courtship and the territorial or aggressive behaviors are very similar. They both have elements in common, such as fin displays and gaping, movement of the heads, changes in the coloration of the snout, for example. And in fact, in several instances, they are almost identical, but very difficult to distinguish. And well, of course, all mudskippers make a frequent use of their dorsal fins, first and second dorsal fins, to display. And all these interactions take place, obviously, out of water. So in general, mudskippers in a tank exhibit high levels of aggressive behaviors. It is, in general, a good thing not to overpopulate the tank. I would say that in a tank of 1 meter times half a meter in terms of area, only 3 to 4 medium-sized Periophthalmus mudskippers can be kept. Let's say 5 to 7 cm.
That's a great segue into keeping mudskippers. We're going to talk a little bit about what would be requirements for folks that were interested in keeping mudskippers. So what about, since it's probably difficult to sex them, when you say 3 to 4 in that area, does it, regardless of sex, or does it matter?
The sex, I mean, both females and males are aggressive. So they are both intraspecifically, I mean, within the species and even amongst different species, they often exhibiting aggressive behaviors, both in females and in males. So sex does make a difference. Mudskippers are usually not sexually dimorphic. I mean, the sexes are pretty similar, so it's not really straightforward to tell sexes apart in general, with the exception of a few species. A good idea would be to reduce the visual interaction. So all sorts of barriers, vertical barriers, logs or whatever are a good idea in general to limit the frequency of these aggressive encounters.
So what would you suggest for someone that's maybe able to find mudskippers at a specialty store or maybe even get them online and wanted to keep them? What's a good aquarium setup, water quality, what would you recommend?
Mudskippers, of course, is a bit general term. It includes a lot of species, as I said, and different species may be rather different in terms of needs and requirements. In general, I would say that, first of all mudskippers available in a pet trade have been captured in the wild, and this must be kept in mind. No one is providing artificially mudskippers bred in captivity. So mudskippers usually come from wetlands which are highly endangered, such as mangrove forests, and they certainly suffer from habitat destruction. So it is a good idea, if you want to rear mudskipper, to be rather careful about how to rear it, because to be highly responsible in terms of its needs, because it is something that we have taken in the wild. This being said, in general, mudskippers are, as we said, pretty hard fishes. And these, as you may know, might be their curse, like for goldfishes, right? Mudskippers have been kept in all sorts of conditions, from pure fresh water to full seawater, with floating pieces of logs in normal aquaria, and in very, of course, inappropriate conditions for their biology. I would say that aquariums in general are not suitable for mudskippers. Only paludariums should be set up. The ideal condition would be to provide a very thick layer of mud substrate, extremely fine sediments in general. This is because otherwise the burrows would collapse out of water, and when they are flooded. It is ideal to provide simulation of tides, so an excursion of the level of water so that the substrate is periodically submerged. If not, at least 50%, I would say, of the substrate should be exposed. And it is not a good idea to produce slopes of any kind, because they would collapse sooner or later, whatever barrier you put in between. So flat and thick exposed substrates, very fine substrates, and you may perhaps provide some pools of water instead of large amounts of water. Filtering is totally useless, because usually, on one hand, mudskippers can tolerate really harsh conditions. On the other hand, if you provide this type of substrate, such as mud and very fine sediments, usually the bacteria inside the substrate can really metabolize the wastes in the substrate and in water. The most important thing I would say is, yes, providing exposed substrate and wet and hot air. Mudskippers can readily, slowly become ill. Their immunitary system can depress very rapidly if the air is dry and the temperature is lower in air than in water. So I would always suggest to treat them just as tropical frogs. So the air must be moist and at least 26, 27 degrees to 30 degrees. But this is, of course, very, very general for different species.
Okay, so for the U.S. folks, upper 70s to low 80s maybe, or mid 80s degrees Fahrenheit.
50% seawater.
Okay, okay, so about 15 ppt roughly, 15 parts per thousand.
Yes.
Just normal lighting? Just normal lighting?
Lighting is not really important. I would say 12 hours light, 12 hours darkness period. There are mudskippers which are inhabiting mudflats and are better adapted to high intensity levels of light and of illumination, and other ones instead live in the forest and prefer shadow. In general, for example, Bolophthalmus is living on exposed, unvegetated substrates because it feeds on the biofilm of algae and other materials they can find on exposed mud, and usually are in full light. While instead, for example, Bolophthalmus and Periophthalmodon are carnivores and are usually living in vegetated areas. So they might prefer shadow, with exceptions, of course.
Okay, so bottom line, the hobbyist that is interested should do a lot of homework, maybe check your website out and see what the specific requirements are. So in terms of, I guess, feeding, you talked a little bit about that. In general, I know there's a lot of different species, but in general, for many of the common Asian and African mudskippers that are in the hobby, what's a good general feed?
Okay, there are carnivores, there are herbivores, there are omnivores. So the diversity is really high. Most mudskippers that can be found in a pet trade are periophthalmous, and all periophthalmous species, to our knowledge, are carnivores. And they are opportunistic feeders, so they would feed anything they are provided with. So I have not any particular recommendations. I mean, I would say bloodworms or whatever. They would eat crickets, flies, shrimps, any sort of animal origin food. And instead, polyophthalmos are much more tricky. In polyophthalmos, they scrap the biofilm on the surface of the mud, and it can be tricky. They can be tricky to be fed. I've heard of someone feeding them with animal food, but of course is not checking then what is their condition, for example, in terms of the liver, So they might accept animal food, these guys, but they are originally herbivores, and they almost exclusively feed on diatoms found on the surface of a mud. And they might not be extremely healthy if fed with animal food.
I've got so many more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. I really appreciate your spending the time with us, Gianluca, and also I'd like to thank our producer, Mark Winter, as well, for making this show possible. Gianluca, did you have any final words or information that you'd wanted to tell our listeners?
Apart from the fact that they should always be reared with extreme responsibility, as I said, there are reports of sound emissions. I personally described the first record of acoustic communication between mudskippers while out of water, which is the first record for fishes in general. But there are reports of sounds that can be heard also by the human ear. So it would be interesting for anyone who is rearing them to listen to them. Possibly they can hear something.
So maybe one day you're going to be our mudskipper translator.
Yeah, possibly so. Who knows?
Well, thank you very much again, Gianluca, for joining us.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
Please be sure to check out Gianluca's great Mudskipper website. The link will be on his Aquariumania webpage. I encourage all of you to visit my Aquariumania blog on Pet Life Radio. Also, if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for a show, email me at drroy@petliferadio.com. That's DrRoy@petliferadio.com. If you're ever in Florida, please be sure to visit the Florida Aquarium in Tampa, one of my favorite aquariums. And if you are still looking for that perfect holiday gift, consider our novel An Animal Life, inspired by my crazy veterinary school days. Go to ananimallife.com to learn more. Until next time, please visit your local aquarium stores and keep your tanks clean and your fish healthy, and keep a lookout for amazing mudskippers.
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.